Thank you to Christian DuPont for graciously hosting this event in such a beautiful space and for making these historical documents available. It's precisely this tangible approach to history and how to learn from it that inspired the choice of speaker for today's distinguished lecture. As Christian mentioned, I'm Jonathan Lawrence, direct the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy. I am very excited to welcome our guest, Jill Lepore, who is a renowned historian, journalist, educator to Boston College today. As a Massachusetts native, Jill Lepore attended Tufts as an undergraduate, where she earned her BA in English and went on to earn a master's in American culture from the University of Michigan, and then her PhD in American Studies from Yale. Professor Lepore taught at UCSD, BU, and Brandeis before joining the faculty of Harvard University, where she is the David Woods Kemper Professor of American History and also professor at Harvard Law School. She is the author of over 15 books, including Encounters in the New World, The Whites of Their Eyes, and the international bestseller, These Truths, A History of the United States. More on her latest book in a moment. In addition to her extensive scholarly work as a historian, many of us know her as a staff writer for The New Yorker, but it would be inaccurate to say in addition to, because it has never been either or during her illustrious career. By integrating her scholarship into her journalism, she has helped her audience understand contemporary events by mining the past for deeper insights and situated our politics in historical perspective. In 2016, for example, she explored the meaning of Hillary Clinton's campaign vis-a-vis historical polemics against female monarchs in Elizabethan England. A recent article examines battles between the courts and the executive by way of William Howard Taft's reform of the US Supreme Court and the subsequent expansion of judicial powers. Another piece sheds light on debates over the teaching of ethnic and racial studies by way of earlier legal battles over the teaching the theory of evolution. I encourage everyone to dig deeper into this archive of articles and books. It is a rewarding use of your time and a spellbinding tour of our political history. She is also the founder of the online history journal Commonplace, which is a destination for exploring and exchanging ideas about early American history and culture. And she has appeared on many popular programs like The Daily Show, Fresh Air, and The Colbert Report. And not least, she is host of the Last Archive podcast, which provides listeners with a history of truth in a world inundated with fake news. Jill Lepore is the recipient of numerous teaching, literary, and scholarly awards, including honorary degrees from Yale and Tufts and NYU. But our annual theme at the Clough Center this year is democratic resilience. And that is the theme that our student fellows and faculty affiliates have discussed and studied in seminars and public events all year, and will continue to do so through the spring. We look forward to publishing their contributions in the forthcoming issue of the Center's journal that will coincide with our spring symposium in March. But we chose this theme of democratic resilience as the quality of constitutional democracy to examine this year because many democracies find themselves under pressure. And in the context of democratic backsliding and increasing polarization, which are alarming trends to many, a worried public can lose historical perspective. Now, one way that perspective gets deployed has been to seek precedent for bad behavior, which some of us may find ourselves explaining away, in part out of faith in our republic's historical ability to self-correct. I found myself in this situation on a recent trip to Berlin, as I tried to defend the soundness of the fundamentals of American democracy to skeptical German counterparts. The irony was not lost. Indeed, I was proud of the US investment that helped cultivate these staunchly democratic allies. But such positive spin often reflects a genuine effort to express faith in the fundamental stability of our constitutional order. But there's also so much precedent for so much else without simply waiting for our institutions to kick in. Indeed, if our predecessors had had that attitude, we know pretty well that we would be in a very different landscape of civil and political rights. So at the Clough Center this year, we've explored this metaphor of resilience because a key feature of resilience is not simply to survive in the same form as before. It implies modification, to adapt and thrive in new circumstances, and to be able to better respond to future shocks within a substantially changed environment. So this theme allows us to focus on solutions. How have voters and civil society groups organized themselves to chart a path through seemingly impossible circumstances? How has our democracy adapted and improved its functioning? Jill Lepore's most recent book, We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution, provides us the perfect opportunity to examine this in a blooming landscape of empirical detail, showing how the origins of the national and state constitutions are much more contingent and experimental than commonly thought. It performs the rare feat of combining historical insights with practical guidance to move forward in today's highly polarized political culture. Danielle Allen described the book accurately as a lyrical journey through the history of the Constitution. It is already clear that this book will do more than win literary prizes. It is also a kind of public service, generating, for example, a searchable archive of over 20,000 proposed amendments. In her career as a scholar, professor, and journalist, Jill Lepore has demonstrated a remarkable commitment to safeguarding and defending the constitutional principles which undergird our democratic framework, and I am delighted to welcome her to the podium for the Clough Center's Fall 2025 Distinguished Lecture.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be in this library, which is a magical, magical place that has, like most libraries, a kind of fairyland quality to it. So thanks everyone for coming out on a pretty chilly evening to talk about the Constitution, which I promise is a very hot topic and I have hot takes on it. I want to do a few things this evening. I want to talk a little bit about how I think about American constitutional history and why we need to examine it, why it's important to have a history of the Constitution that you and I carry around in our heads, like a family history or, the history of something that you know well in your town or your neighborhood. Why we should have a more intimate understanding of the history of the Constitution. I have a constitutional quiz I'm going to give, so fair warning. It's a small group, so a lot of pressure on you guys to answer the questions in my quiz. And then I'm really looking forward to a good discussion. We'll have plenty of time, I'm sure, for Q&A. So what I want to do to begin is really ask us to think a little bit about our relationship as Americans or as people living in the United States to the Constitution. What is the relationship between the people, we the people, and this document? This is something that the framers of the Constitution wrote about a great deal, urging Americans of their era not to be too concerned with the document itself, to understand that the document was meant to be an expression of the ideas of the American people, and that it carries no force here, as James Madison thought as the principal author of the Constitution, without the approval of the people. It's a dead letter without our approval, and that approval is required of all of us in an ongoing fashion. It's not that the Constitution was written in 1787 and then we simply inherit it. Our approval is kind of a running game, that we continue to be ourselves the authors of the Constitution, either by accepting it as written or by changing it, by amendment. In fact, when Madison was asked to draft the first set of amendments to the Constitution, the very first amendment he intended to include was one that insisted upon the right of the people to amend the Constitution. It's one of the amendments that got lost in the editing in Congress. But for Madison, this was the most important element of a written Constitution, was the people's ability to constantly revise and rewrite it. That was the way in which we would own the Constitution, that we would in fact consent to be governed by the exercise of our capacity to amend the Constitution. And the framers of the Constitution understood that in many ways its chief contribution to constitutionalism in the 18th century was its amendment provision. The Constitution, our Constitution was written, England's Constitution is an unwritten Constitution. The framers really wanted to write down the Constitution. They liked the idea of being able to point to chapter and verse and say, you know, what Congress is doing is unconstitutional, or what the president just said is unconstitutional. They wanted it written down, but they also knew that that posed a problem. If you write something down, what if it becomes out of date? So they wrote this amendment provision, Article 5 of the Constitution, into the Constitution. They expected it to be used often, not super often. They wanted the process of amendment to be difficult, but they didn't want it to be too difficult. They certainly didn't want it to become impossible. And they were committed to the process, and they worked hard to think about what that process ought to look like. But they also bore into that framing a sense of amendment that I think we often forget. The word, it's easy to kind of corral it into its narrow legal meaning. You know that if you write a will and you want to change it, you have to file an amendment, right? We think of it in that legal context. But amendment in English to amend is a very close relative of the word mend. You amend a text and you mend a textile. But mending and amending really mean the same thing. They mean repair, correction, improvement, recovery. So we have a lot of language, even down to our day, about amending and mending that has this moral quality of the notion of moral improvement. If you hurt someone, you have to make amends. If you behave egregiously, you really would do well to mend your ways. We still use the words in those ways. And I think if you look at American history, you can discover that the philosophy of amendment, the idea that we adopted a constitution in 1787 as a new nation, and that constitution was meant to be corrected, improved, repaired, that we could make amends for errors in our past, that we could adjust, update. This is the philosophy of amendment is foundational to the founding of written constitutionalism in the United States. And it's also to be found in the history of the Constitution, the celebration of the people's capacity, we the people, the celebration of we the people and our capacity to demand amendments to the Constitution. So one of the things that I ended up doing in this book that I have written that is a new history of the Constitution is insisting that I think to the degree that Americans do have any sense of the history of the Constitution, that history is a series of Supreme Court decisions, right? Like you sort of list them all in your mind. This is how constitutional history is taught in law schools, for instance. You know, you go from Marbury to Dred Scott to Lochner to Brown v. Board to Roe v. Wade. You just kind of walk through Supreme Court decisions, and that is the history of the Constitution. But that's a very narrow way, I think, of considering the history of the Constitution, because much of the history of the Constitution consists of the attempts of Americans to change it. And if you try to envision and research the history of the Constitution with an eye for these efforts, these attempted amendments, nearly all of which have failed, you see a much richer, more complicated history of the Constitution. One of the things you see when you look at attempted amendment as a measure of an index to constitutional history is you can see women that you can't otherwise really see. So 1775 here, this is a satirical sort of Hogarthian depiction of American women writing a document, penning a document. The woman with the quill is writing a document that begins, "We the ladies." It's a critique of a group of women in North Carolina who formed what was referred to as a female Congress, to model their political participation in the drafting of constitutions and declarations and resolves that the Sons of Liberty were writing here in Boston. You can see, obviously, these women are being mocked as being so busy with their constitutional drafting that they're ignoring this poor child in the bottom who's being licked by a dog. There's a lot of sexualized imagery here that we could spend a lot of time with. You also see, for instance, that the Constitution itself, of course, was generally figured as a woman, allegorically as a woman. The middle image here from 1866 is the Constitution as a woman, Liberty, holding the 14th Amendment in her arms as a baby. So we sometimes have a weird, freaky, hyperpolarized debate about whether the Constitution is dead or it is a living document. The Constitution was a woman who could give birth. Amendments were pregnancies. A failed amendment was a miscarriage. There's this whole language about constitutionalism that has to do with reproduction that we don't think about, that I think is important to find a way to see. In our understanding of women's role in constitutional history, the story only really begins with the final image here, which is depicting women at a famous suffrage parade in 1913, a parade in Washington that ends up resulting in, finally in 1920, in the 19th Amendment, in which women gain the right to vote. But my point is here, if you're looking for attempts to change the amendment, most of them involve people trying to write their way to change the Constitution. Most of them involve people trying to write their way into the Constitution, and that includes, from the very beginning, women. You also see Black Americans, free and unfree, free blacks in the North, enslaved men and women in the South, seeking constitutional change by way of constitutional amendment in a way that you don't see when you're really just looking at Supreme Court decisions. You tend to see certainly enslaved Americans, but also free blacks as utterly passive in the face of constitutional change. So just visually here, just some images that mean something to me. On the left is, this is the Hall of Congress on January 31st, 1865, when Congress passed the 13th Amendment, ending slavery in the United States. The galleries and the balconies and the floor were completely full with men and women, black and white. There was an expected vote. There had been previous votes. This had failed to pass Congress. It passed that day. There's a wonderful letter written by Charles Redmond Douglas, who's Frederick Douglass's son. Frederick Douglass was not there that day, but his son was, wearing his Union uniform. And he writes this kind of fantastic letter to his father explaining, this was the cover of Harper's Magazine the next week. He writes this fantastic letter to his father explaining, like, people are weeping, screaming, women are throwing their kerchiefs, men are throwing their hats. It was like the new birth of the country, it's called the new birth of freedom, the 13th Amendment. And he says to his father, Frederick Douglass, his son, says, I've seen black people celebrate like this before, but I ain't never seen white people do this. It's kind of a fantastic letter of just a spirit of jubilation. The middle is a celebration, a parade held in Baltimore celebrating the ratification of the 15th Amendment, granting black men the right to vote. And here on the right, from the era of Reconstruction, is a copy, the cover page of a copy of a constitution written by a black constitutional convention during the time when Confederate officers, and soldiers enlisted, anyone who served in the Confederate Army was disqualified from office. So new state conventions were held to write new constitutions for the formerly seceded southern states, and they were written by black men who lavishly celebrated the act of drafting constitutions. You see, when you think about amendment and get your eyes off of their locked gaze on the Supreme Court, the importance of Native nations and their constitutional traditions that they bring into their own constitutional writing. The first written constitution of a Native nation, the Cherokee Constitution of 1827, really influential and important document. And on the right, the Constitutional Convention held by the proposed state of Sequoia among the Cherokee in 1905. This is a picture of the men at their constitutional convention. The tradition of Native nations holding constitutional conventions is an especially vibrant tradition today, at a time when Americans in the states have entirely abandoned the practice of holding constitutional conventions. You just see, in short, the centrality of the idea of amendment to how Americans think about their political life. The capacity of the people to write constitutions, to ask for, to demand change of the federal constitution, of their state constitutions. Here's just a little excerpt from a guide to how to go about trying to amend the Constitution, insisting that the history of the progress of a people is written into its Constitution and it must be ever open to recognize the advance in each age. And generally, certainly after the Civil War, amendment was considered almost always the proper route for moral crusades, right? The moral crusade to end slavery, the moral crusade to grant the right to vote to women, the moral crusade for temperance. Moral improvement found its mechanism not just in political movements or in electoral parties, but more specifically in constitutional amendment. That banner that I showed you in an earlier slide, here it is depicted, here it is hanging from a carriage at the Women's March on Washington of 1913. So if you're looking for amendment, you see a lot of action in the progressive era. There are 4 constitutional amendments passed between 1913 and 1920, one of which leads to the popular election of the U.S. Senate. Previously, the Senate was elected by state legislators, one of which grants Congress the power to tax incomes, which was something Congress had tried to do twice, but had twice been overturned by the Supreme Court. The progressive era, its last successful amendment is the 19th, granting women the right to vote, but progressives managed to pass in 1924 a constitutional amendment abolishing child labor. It fails of ratification in a slow and deathly battle with Southern textile mill owners who want to be able to continue to employ young black children in textile mills. They managed to defeat the child labor amendment. It's one of just a handful of amendments to pass Congress and fail of ratification. The Prohibition Amendment, of course, is later repealed, but the real turn in the history of amendment in the United States in the 20th century occurs during the 1930s, when FDR, who had endured the struggle to try to ratify the child labor amendment. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, had been a leader of the effort to abolish child labor. When the Supreme Court begins striking down the New Deal, elements of the New Deal in 1935, FDR is urged by his advisors to constitutionalize the New Deal in a slate of amendments the way an earlier generation of progressives had. He had watched what happened to the child labor amendment, and he decided to instead bully his way through the court, to brazen it out with the Supreme Court, which marked a real turn in the 20th century in terms of liberals' interest in securing constitutional amendment. You may well know that constitutional amendment in the United States has been largely evanescent since the 1970s. The last meaningful amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1971. The next year, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, passed Congress, went to the states for ratification, seemed likely to be adopted very quickly, but instead, like the Child Labor Amendment in the 1920s, faced a very strong opposition, in this case led by Phyllis Schlafly, who was a political genius. So in my lifetime, the U.S. Constitution has not been meaningfully amended. And there really aren't a lot of attempts to amend the Constitution anymore. Recognizably, you might say there are hardly any. It's not worth spending your money on doing something that is effectively impossible. So in terms of democratic resilience, one of the big problems with American constitutionalism is that the legitimacy of any constitution lies in question when it lies beyond the people's power of amendment, which has been the case in the United States, again, since 1971. It's not that there haven't been efforts. In the 1970s in particular, social conservatives fought for a right to life amendment, even as pro-choice activists sought instead constitutional change through the courts. Fiscal conservatives sought a balanced budget amendment, which passed the Senate in 1982 and was endorsed by Ronald Reagan. There's been a lot of constitutional change in the years since and a lot of constitutional agitation, but there has really been no meaningful even effort to amend the Constitution. So it's useful, I think, to think a little bit about this history as a pattern. Just to make the point that amendments tend to happen in American history in bursts. The first 10 were the Bill of Rights, after which there's kind of a very long amendment drought. In black are constitutional amendments introduced on the floor of Congress, and red are those that are ratified. Then there are the Civil War and Reconstruction amendments, then a long drought, then those progressive amendments that I talked about, the 16th to the 20th. Then there's a little bit of activity in the middle decades of the 20th century, an awful lot of interest in constitutional amendment, but at the point we are at now, no one even bothers to propose amendments to the Constitution on the floor of Congress. Again, it's just not worth doing. They're not going to go anywhere. So one of the things that I was really compelled by in doing this work was I don't think we even have a legible history of attempts to amend the Constitution. So as Jonathan mentioned, I worked on a project funded by the NEH for a number of years with a team of undergraduates, and we've compiled this database at the amendmentsproject.org. So if you want to look at previous attempts to amend the U.S. Constitution, that's something that you can easily now do. You can search by topic or by political party, by year, by state. There's a lot of ways to analyze that data as well, tools that are within it. But here comes the quiz. I want to just see what you all might know about the history of efforts to amend the Constitution. So I'm going to show you some proposed constitutional amendments. These are for the U.S. Constitution. And I'm going to ask you what year you think these were. These are all introduced on the floor of Congress by a member of Congress. I'm going to ask you what year, and if anyone gets the year right, why. Congress shall not have the power to declare war until voted upon at a popular referendum. What year do you think this was introduced? Yeah. 1975? Okay. 1917. Why 1917? First World War. Americans were wildly opposed to entry into the war in Europe. No soldier shall be enlisted for any longer term than 4 years, except in time of war, and then for no longer than the term of the continuance of the war. Year? Any guesses? 1968? What? Okay, 1968, Vietnam War, no. 1788? Okay, another war that Americans were really exhausted by. Congress shall have power by resolution passed by 2/3 vote of each House of Congress to override any decision of the Supreme Court. (1920s? Okay, good guess. 1963, anyone know why 1963? Civil one man, one vote. Yeah, Southern segregationists were very unhappy with the one man, one vote rulings. Same person shall not be elected president of the United States a second time, nor shall the president be elected from the same state 2 terms in succession. Year? 1890? 1940s? 1940s is a good guess because we do end up having a lot of debates about presidential successor notes. 1815, anyone know why? Thank you very much, Virginia. 4 of the first 5 presidents were from Virginia because of the 3/5 clause that granted disproportionate electoral power to large slave-owning states. New Englanders were really pissed off about that. No person born to parents who are unlawfully in the United States at the time of the birth shall be a United States citizen on account of birth in the United States. 2000, very good guess, 1994. This effort to overturn birthright citizenship, which now appears to be being done by fiat, was attempted quite unsuccessfully by way of constitutional amendment. The right of any citizen to be assigned to the public school of his parents' or guardian's choice of a minor or to the public school of his choice of an adult shall not be denied or abridged by the United States. We're in Boston, so this should be a good place people might know the answer to this question. (1970) really, its integration, especially comes to be an issue in Boston over forced busing. President of the United States should be elected for a term of 6 years. No person who has been elected the president shall again be eligible to that office. My point is it's okay that you don't know the answers to these questions because no one knows the history of failed amendments, but this is 1836. This proposal is quite a common one for a single 6-year term for the presidency. It's made repeatedly over many, many years. The president shall not, without the approval of Congress, grant a pardon to a person for a criminal offense against the United States for which such person has not been convicted. Yeah. Yes. Ding, 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 ding. 1977, right. Abolition of the present restriction upon the amendment of the Constitution so that the instrument may be made amendable by a majority of the voters in the majority of the states. There are many, many proposals over the course of American history to make amendment easier because it became very quickly clear that it was too difficult, in the sense that far more difficult than the framers of the Constitution intended. This is also a not uncommonly proposed amendment. This one happens to be from 1912. Progressives did finally break through in 1913, and then they had 4 amendments ratified pretty quickly, but they had been trying for decades to get those amendments through. So a question I want us to sort of spend a minute on, I have a little bit more to say before I turn to all of you for your thoughts, is I could give you explanations for the other constitutional droughts in American history, the other long periods where it was impossible to amend the Constitution or where no one succeeded in any event. But why is it now difficult? Why hasn't it really been done since 1971? One theory, of course, is polarization. Political polarization in this country really began to rise around 1968 and has been rising fairly continuously ever since. It's very difficult to get a double supermajority for anything. It's very difficult for Congress to even pass a law or a budget or set a budget. So reaching the bar that is required for a constitutional amendment is, of course, far more difficult. But I think it's also used, so that's one really important explanation. Another could be the intensity and fervor and success of the campaign to defeat the ERA convinced people to not bother trying to amend the Constitution. Another, though, reason might be to think about a competing understanding of the Constitution that arose also in 1971 and is marked by the publication that year of a law review article by Robert Bork, who was then a legal scholar at Yale. Bork was really opposed to the right to privacy decisions of the late 1960s involving the decriminalization of birth control, which would then also undergird the Supreme Court's decision in Roe v. Wade in 1973. Bork offered up a framework for what came to be known in 1980 as originalism. And it really came to the public's attention in 1987 after Reagan nominated Bork to the Supreme Court. And his confirmation hearings were held in the Senate Judiciary Committee just as the nation was celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Constitution, which was completed on September 17th, 1787. Here's Winnie and Minnie and Mickey celebrating that moment. So it's useful to think about that moment for a minute, the 1970s and the rise of originalism, as marking a new era in the history of the Constitution, when the philosophy of amendment and the mechanism of amendment is dormant and inoperable, and the philosophy of originalism becomes predominant and later triumphant. So one last thought I want to offer is what the cost has been to the United States in the amendment provision becoming inoperable since 1971. If you look at constitutions around the world, which you can do using the Comparative Constitutions Project, one of the things that nations around the world did beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s is pass environmental protection amendments and environmental rights amendments. These were also at the very same time, these are here in blue, at the very same time these were introduced as proposed amendments on the floor of the U.S. Congress. These are in the red lines representing efforts by members of Congress to introduce environmental protection amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And if the flurry of amendments that had begun in 1961, 4 amendments were ratified between 1961 and 1971, had continued, one of them that might have gotten through, like the Equal Rights Amendment, might have been an environmental protection amendment. There was a lot of popular support for it. Remember, the 1970s began as what Richard Nixon called the environmental decade. One of the more moving documents in the spirit of these archival discoveries that I love so much is this little petition I found in the papers of Birch Bayh, the Indiana senator who was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee's subcommittee on constitutional amendments, these school children sent this petition urging the Senate to hold hearings on an environmental protection amendment that had been submitted to Congress. It's not clear that any of these, if such an amendment had passed, that it would have done all that much good. A lot of nation states have environmental protection amendments in their clauses in their constitution that have not stopped the earth from burning. But if you think about the scale of environmental collapse since the 1970s, and you imagine what might have been possible if the United States had actually constitutionalized attempts to protect the environment, we might be living in a very different natural world here in 2025. So I think there really are consequences to the, not only to the unamendability of the U.S. Constitution, but to its underdevelopment, a kind of stagnating of constitutional ideas to such a degree that I don't think Americans can even really imagine new constitutional ideas anymore. So I did a project a few years ago for my podcast in which we did an episode that was essentially a counterfactual, imagining that environmental protection amendment that those school children wanted had in fact passed through Congress and been ratified in 1972. And one of the things we did was we had 1972 is also when the Lorax came out. So we wrote our own constitutional amendment and imagined that it was ratified in 1972. And it was far more ambitious than that one that was, thank you, than the ones that were on the floor of Congress. But I'm going to tell you about it because it's crazy. I will admit this is a crazy constitutional amendment. But the idea of doing this podcast episode was to insist that it's important to actually have some imagination around the Constitution. So this constitutional amendment established a third branch of Congress, known as the Chamber of Nature, but colloquially called the Tree Branch, in which representation was in proportion to the number of trees in every state relative to the number of trees in such a state at the time that state entered the Union. In other words, it would have rewarded keeping tree cover and thereby lessening greenhouse gases. So we had a composer write a Schoolhouse Rock jingle for it. And I'm going to close by playing you the Schoolhouse Rock jingle for a constitutional amendment that never happened, was never even written, but that I hope gives you some sense of a world of possibility that we have lost.
Article 2. The Chamber of Nature shall be composed of members chosen every fourth year by the people of the several states. Representation in the chamber shall be apportioned among the several states according to the number of trees in the state relative to the number of trees in the state present at the time the state entered the Union.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so we do have some time for questions, and I'm happy to take them. Yeah.
I was wondering, like, what role you see, like, state constitutions playing. Do they pick up the work that Congress abandons when these amendments get proposed? And, like, you hear, like, states as laboratories of democracy. Do you find that this holds true for these amendments as well?
Yes, there's a very interesting relationship, and there's quite a bit of political science on the relationship as well as legal history. In the book, I spend a lot of time establishing that everything in the U.S. Constitution comes from the states in the first place. So I spend a lot of time on the very early state constitutions that begin in 1776, right? We think of next year, 2026, as the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, but it is in fact the 250th anniversary as well of the first constitutions of the United States. I spend a lot of time on the 19th century state constitutions. They often lead in reform, right? So in the progressive era, it's the states that are reforming their constitutions. In the 19th century, they're at once democratizing their state constitutions by dropping property qualifications for voting, but then they're also adding racial restrictions. Like, you can't really tell the history of the federal constitution without reference to state constitutions. At the same time, as a matter of storytelling, it gets pretty unwieldy very quickly, as you can imagine. I think your question was really about the present day, where I think there's quite a lot of dynamism in state constitutions. Legal scholars, in my experience, are incredibly sniffy about state constitutions. They're just stupid statutes. These things shouldn't be in a constitution. Like, legal scholars get very like, I can't believe people have this stuff in their state constitutions. They don't belong there, largely because of referenda, and the initiative and referendum measures that are progressive reforms. Because states amend the constitutions all the time. U.S. state constitutions look a lot like the constitutions of nation states around the world. So between 1787 and the present day, there have been about 12,000 constitutional amendments to the federal constitution introduced in Congress. There have been of which 27 have been ratified. We have like one of the lowest amendment rates in the world. In the states, in that same time, there have been about 12,000 amendments introduced to state constitutions, of which about 8,000 have been ratified, like a 75% ratification rate. So that's what I mean by the dynamism. There's still a lot of amending going on. What I think is also interesting, and there's a long answer to your question, but states used to fairly regularly hold constitutional conventions. And many states have in their constitutions that they have to ask the people every 10 or 15 or 20 years, should we hold a convention? And for the last half century, states have all said no to that. So not since Rhode Island in 1986 has any U.S. state held a full-dress constitutional convention. I think that's actually the most significant thing that's going on in the states, because I think state constitutional conventions are super healthy, even when they don't accomplish very much. I just think the process of convening is a really important reminder that, hey, we do govern ourselves, we write our own laws, we write our own constitutions, we grant our power to these legislators, it's not theirs to take from us. So I think in terms of these questions of resilience, I think the lack of convening to deliberate over constitutions in states is a real problem. Yeah, back here. You want to pass the mic over?
Thanks so much. I was curious, what do you think the role and responsibility of education is in this space? I think I loved Schoolhouse Rock growing up, and I also loved your really eloquent phrasing of to amend something is to mend something that's broken and something that needs to be addressed. But that's also the first time I've heard it phrased in that way in the constitutional amendment space. So I wonder, especially as someone who comes from early childhood education research, what do you think should be changed in terms of classroom dialogue as well?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think we lay a lot of blame for things on educators, and I think K-12 educators are the people doing things right. So I don't oh, if only they could fix this. Because I think the things that, even early grades educators do are really important. My kids went to public school here in the Boston area, and it's seems sort of hokey when they have the first few weeks of school, the kids devise the classroom rules and then they vote on them. Well, that's constitutional writing. That's really important. And to learn, we are we're a community. And so we have to have some rules, but we can talk about what those rules are going to be. And what if we did this rule, how would that affect these people? And I just think there's a ton of deep civic learning that is part of being in a classroom. The place in the United States where people are actually spending hours with different people they might disagree with, and being asked to rise to the occasion and be decent to one another, is the public school classroom. So I don't actually think there's more there in the sense of, I think there's a greater need to celebrate what is done in public school classrooms, and to venerate and properly pay school teachers. I just think that's much more the problem than, we need a brand new curriculum.
Thank you.
Yeah, feel free to hear. I think this guy, or wherever you think is fine.
I want to make a point and run it by you, and I will preface it by saying I'm cribbing shamelessly from a political scientist at Princeton whose name is, I believe, Francis Lee, that it's not just polarization, it's polarization with party competitiveness. We've been throughout American history, there have been a lot of times when one party kind of is in the driver's seat. And right now, since roughly 1980, we've been in a situation where neither party is in the driver's seat, and either party could win all the federal stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an entirely defensible position. There is just great political science on the very many forces at play that have paralyzed American politics. Like, we could talk about the failure of Congress to exercise any of its legislative authority. We could talk about the imperial presidency, the emergency presidency. We could talk about the usurpation of the powers of the Supreme Court. Like, there's just it's a very long list. One of the things that troubles me the most is the nationalization of local politics, like where people are voting for, their neighborhood representative on the school council, and somehow this is about the CDC, like that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm not going to dispute your theory, but it's just another thing. Yeah. Do you want to pass it back to the person behind you?
Okay, hi. You promised us hot takes, and
Did I not give you any hot takes?
well, we're on the way. So I want to give you an opportunity to give us a hot take about the state of constitutionalism in the current administration, with regard to there's pushing the boundaries of law, and then there's pushing the boundaries of the Constitution. And I wonder if you might offer a hot take on our current situation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm going to say anything that 1,000 other people haven't said, and many of them in this room, or you people in this room, and that 1,000 other people haven't disagreed with. Like, there's no uniform opinion. There's not an orthodoxy here. I mean, just to step back for a minute, constitutions govern governments, governments govern people, and the Constitution is not currently governing the government. I think there's a real legitimacy question with regard to the capacity of this Constitution to govern people who are determined to exceed the authority that the Constitution grants to them. Some reporter called me some months ago and said, what has been the oddest thing to you about, this is maybe like a first 100 days kind of question, about the first 100 days, because I'd written a piece for the New Yorker about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And no one wanted to talk about the piece, because what the piece was, I decided I would read a book a day from the Penguin Little Black Classics books, which are these like 50-page classics. It's, like Othello and Ovid and Sherlock Holmes or whatever. It's just like Penguin's classics, but like little ones. And I read one a day. And then I wrote about the Trump administration through the lens of the classics. And so but nobody wants to hear the humanities are dead, so no one wants to hear that. But people were like, what's the most outrageous thing that has happened in the first 100 days? I'm like, I hate these questions. But what I said was, I was really genuinely surprised. There was a TV clip, I don't remember who the interviewer was, but someone asked President Trump whether it was his duty to uphold the Constitution, and he said, I don't know. I'll have to talk to my lawyers. And that set me back on my heels.
Hi, thanks so much for this, and thanks for the hot take, by which I'm referring to apportionment by trees. I was curious what you might think about the ways that our constitutional system changes in the absence of constitutional amendments, even in this kind of amendment drought that we're in. Right? One way would be this idea that certain ordinary legislation takes on a quasi-constitutional status, right? So the Equal Rights Amendment fails, but there are very similar provisions in the Civil Rights Act, which no one is going to touch with a 10-foot pole. It might as well be a constitutional amendment. Also, you mentioned originalism. Another way that changes happen in the absence of constitutional amendment is this idea of the living constitution, that even the kind of fixed text has a changed meaning. The Warren Court expanding the rights of criminal defendants pretty massively without amendment, for example. So I was wondering what you thought about the relationship between this explicit way of changing the Constitution and these implicit ways, and why the explicitness is so important.
Yeah, well, it's a perfectly phrased question that I think answers the question itself, right? You've listed a number of methods of what legal scholars talk about as informal constitutional change. Formal constitutional change, meaning specifically Article 5 amendment. Although I think people who talk about formal constitutional change sometimes talk about Supreme Court decisions that, very explicitly offer a new kind of a rule. But exactly, the kind of de facto, like ERA would be a great example. Many kinds of Supreme Court decisions, many just different congressional actions. We could think about the implications of some of the Trump administration's constitutional interpretations, informal constitutional change as well, right? I do think that there is a meaningful difference, and one meaningful difference is that it's much more difficult to overturn a constitutional amendment than a Supreme Court decision. So there were actually a lot of interest in the 1960s in pressing civil rights activists to constitutionalize civil rights beyond the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And you can go back through the records of the NAACP, and they're like, "Are you kidding? Like, we can't. Like, we just won. Like, we finally effing won. We could lose a constitutional amendment. Why would we do that? Like, we won." The same thing was true with same-sex marriage. In 2015, the Bergfeld decision, which constitutionalized the same-sex marriage, a lot of people said in the legal community and of LGBTQ advocacy, maybe we should seek a constitutional amendment, just like the extra security of that, right? And people were like, but we won, and we could lose that. Why would we take on that risk? So for much of the 20th century, liberals and the civil rights movement both, any number of causes, like, it was actually unusual that the women's rights movement pressed for the ERA. Because in most other ways, liberals were it was just an easier path to go to the court. There's that. It's not permanent, right? Or it doesn't have the same security. But also, it doesn't involve the people, right? I mean, if you're gonna complain about judicial supremacy all day, you actually have to be willing to use different paths to constitutional change than going to the judiciary. So I think that one of the deformities of our politics on the long list is how much each Supreme Court appointment matters. Because the only way really to change the Constitution these days, well, I mean, Trump has a different idea about how to do it, but the only way in our system of laws to do it is to appoint people to the court who are going to do what you want them to do, which puts an enormous amount of pressure on those appointments. Combined with a sort of cult of celebrity around Supreme Court justices, it's just a huge mess.
Very quickly, Professor Lepore, thank you for making constitutional history so interesting. As you said in the beginning, when we have this political polarization, basically we do not have constitutional amendments. On the other side, judicial interpretation seems much more ideological. So there's no way out for we, the people?
I think there is let's move to some other part of the room, just as I know there's people over here. There are some very interesting projects going on. There's an organization called Democracy 2076. It's a sort of a youth organization, and their thing is for the 250th anniversary of the country, they're holding citizens' assemblies all over the country, asking people like, we know we can't change the Constitution right now. But if you were to imagine the Constitution in 2076, the 300th anniversary of the country, what would you want in it that's not in it? What would you want out of it that isn't it? Like, just having people have the conversation. That's why I do my goofy, like, if trees could be represented, just be like, you know what? Nobody thought that people should be represented in proportion to their numbers before the United States did it. Like, that's not how, proportionate representation is an invention of the late 18th century. Like, proportionate representation of trees is also just an invention, right? It seems actually somewhat reasonable to me, to be perfectly honest. So they're trying to get people to have these conversations. There are also a couple of interesting workarounds. One is what's called a sunrise amendment. So for instance, most Americans actually do not like the Electoral College. Half of Americans think it's good for them in their political interests right now. And so they don't want to get rid of it right now. But even those people are like, it's going to screw us someday. So one proposal is to craft an amendment abolishing the Electoral College, say, in the year 2060. So then it's just a crapshoot. Who knows, right? Like, if we all think, who knows if it would benefit you? First of all, most of us are going to be dead. Not the students, but the rest of us are going to be dead. So, okay. But also, you don't know that would benefit your political interests. Or the parties are likely to be completely different. Let's hope they're both gone. But, like, it seems like that's a way to at least rekindle the capacity for amendment. There's a couple of workarounds like that. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the talk. It was fascinating. I want to propose an alternative hypothesis for why the Constitution hasn't changed a lot. And it's not that it's not just not amendable right now because of polarization, but that this Constitution is not mendable, that it's just done, and you should just get rid of it. That would be a better strategy. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting idea, and there's actually a long tradition of that's called anti-constitutionalism, and in the literature. There's a long tradition of that. You know, there have been a lot of Americans at different points in history been like, we just can't fix this. Whatever it is that at their moment is the thing that is the big problem. And there have been very distinguished Yale legal scholar Samuel Moyn, who's also a historian and former colleague of mine, wrote a piece in the New York Times a few years ago called just like, why are we even arguing about the Constitution anymore? Like that how our politics works is, you know, people have to say, my plan is constitutional and yours is unconstitutional. And it's just a proxy for like, do what I want, not what you want. And he's like, we should just like stop bothering, try to contain our politics within this outdated Constitution whose tortured interpretation is hindering moral progress in this country, right? I think there are a lot of serious people who would agree with that. That said, I can report that it's a very selective, completely weird audience, but like, I was at a big like town hall meeting in Seattle and someone said that. And it was the last question of the night and I was so tired because it was like the wrong time zone. You know, when you're in California, like you're on the West Coast and you fly there and you're like, Jesus Christ, why are we still up? And I was like, this is the last question. And I just looked at people, I was like, okay, this one I'm putting to a vote. How many people want to just be done with this Constitution? And how many people, and like 3 people out of like 1,000 people raised their hand. I was like, okay, maybe you're tired too. How many people want to fight for this Constitution? And everybody raised their hand. It was really weird. I was kind of overwhelmed. I'm like, well, it is a group of people in Seattle who've come to a talk about the Constitution late at night. You know? So, you know, it's a weird audience, but I don't think there's popular support for your idea. In fact, you know, there's excellent work, suggesting that the problem with our Constitution is our veneration of it. That's something that Madison worried about, right? The framers always said, like, a problem with writing this down is the older it gets, the more people are likely to venerate it. And then where will they be? They'll be really stuck. Jonathan, I don't know how we are for time. Is it like one more question? 2 more questions? You tell me. Okay, we'll do 2 more? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. Does the fact that the U.S. Constitution contains few articles, mainly focusing on fundamental principle, reduce the need to modify the Constitution? We can maybe reach the same goal by amending laws, or the executive can use, as President Trump is doing, use a decree, or unlike other countries like in Europe where the Constitution contains, in France,
right.
108 articles.
Yeah, a lot of our state constitutions look like that. Yeah, and I think, you know, this view hasn't been expressed this evening, but there are many Americans who would say the reason for American prosperity and stability and progress and economic growth is that we have had a stable constitution that has been very little amended and that is very short, right? It is an outline and a framework for the structure of government, and it is not a set of statutes, a list of details. It doesn't easily become outdated. And 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 that's why we should venerate it, right? I think that's a huge part of the tradition of American constitutionalism, and it's in tension with a lot of what I've said here, but it's an entirely defensible position. It's not mine. But that is, you can very well defend such a position, and that the sort of blueprint nature of it, right? It's not the building, it's the building plans. And a lot of state constitutions are like, this is a building. There's porticos, there's cornices, there's all the paintings on the walls, it's like everything. And a lot of other national constitutions are like that. And so therefore the average lifespan of a national constitution is 19 years. They just get revised all the time, scrapped and started again. But Thomas Jefferson thought that should be the average lifespan of a constitution because it's the length of an average generation. And his whole point was we should have a constitutional convention every 20 years because how can the next generation consent to something they didn't even write? That's actually kind of how a lot of people around the world think about constitutions because they act upon that. That's not our tradition at the level of the federal constitution. And you could say, well, okay, that's worked extremely well, or maybe you'll say it hasn't and the Constitution's always been full of shortcomings. The question is it still work? Even if you were to stipulate it has worked, is it still working, I think is a tough question. Because a president declaring what the Constitution means and then enforcing that is entirely outside the Constitution, and that is the world in which we are currently living.
I just wanted to follow up. Thank you for this great talk. Is there a correlation over time between the degree to which people trust each other? And I don't mean this just as a proxy for polarization, but one of your answers earlier was, why not pursue an amendment about same-sex marriage? Well, I might lose it. And so is there a degree to which some of these periods of more robust amendments are periods of greater civic trust of each other? And again, not polarization as proxy, but what role does trust and distrust play in this process?
Yeah, I think that's a shrewd question in that I think it is almost the whole of the explanation for why we don't have state constitutional conventions anymore. You'd have to really be willing, like you ask people about that and you're like, well, so your state, Michigan I think recently voted down one of these like mandatory ballot. Well, why? I wouldn't trust my fellow citizens to change our fundamental law. Or, that's just going to be some millionaires are going to get in there and they're going to push through this that I don't like, or this, the opposite thing, or, a bunch of radical left lunatics are going to do this, or a bunch of radical right lunatics are going to like that. And then, there have been efforts, some of them fairly serious, to get enough support from the states to call for a federal constitutional convention. And over the course of the 20th century, it's beginning in the late 1960s, progressives have always opposed that. Not because they don't believe in having a convention, but because they think they would lose. And at some point, that's what democracy is. Maybe you're going to lose. And, I hear people sometimes are, you're advocating for a constitutional convention. I'm not. But then I'm like, why are you so afraid of that? And they're like, we'll end up with a MAGA constitution. I'm like, we now have that. That's what you get when you're unwilling to sit down and argue with people. That's what you get when you don't have democratic resilience. Thank you very much.